who I'm talking to here.
All right.
And let me see if I can stretch this so I get more pictures in here. It's no fun just speaking to a computer screen. I like to speak to faces, at least at the beginning. As
Okay.
Gene and Fred
There we
said,
go.
I'm Steve McDaniel. I'm not employed by anybody because I've been, people ask me when I'm going to retire. I say I'm self-employed. You know, what's to retire from? So most of my classmates are retired, but I'm not. Don't have any plans to until I can't see to take pictures anymore or lift a 200-pound beehive. So then I might retire. I don't know. But that's what I do is professional nature photography and beekeeping. And the last 3 weeks have been like total immersion in beekeeping because a lot of people's bees have died, and that's what I'm going to be talking about tonight. So they have to replace them. And I bought from a commercial beekeeper 100 beehives, starter colonies. It's a little box about yay big and holds 5 frames out of a beehive. And that's what you use to restock a dead out or to start a new colony. So, and I've sold them all. So I made a few more. So I still have some for me, but basically I've been trying to supply people with enough bees to keep in it. You know, your bees die and you can't get new ones. You're not a beekeeper anymore. So it's been like that since 2012. Most of our bees are dying every year, and it's tragic and it's heartbreaking. And you know, we'll talk more about that as we go along. I've been keeping very busy because in a box of bees with maybe 10,000 bees, there's one queen. And a lot of these people that bought starter colonies from me wanted the queen marked, which meant I had to find her. And that's the tricky part. You're going into this box full of bees and finding the one big one and putting a dot of paint on her back and picking her up and doing that without harming her, because otherwise, if you do, you've killed the colony. But I'd like to know a little bit about you folks. You're members of the Entomological Society or students in Fred's class. So you all are at least, can I assume that you are fascinated at least by insects? Is that a fair assumption? Anybody say they're not? Little
I think
feedback here.
they don't realize how fascinated they are, the students, because everybody.
Now I'd like a show of hands with your cameras on. How many of you love insects? Okay, a few at least. That's good. That's good. I gotta put my 2 cents worth in there. They are fascinating and they are lovable. And if you are an entomologist and
Steve,
people
you got
know
at least
you're
2 papers here tonight.
or working on learning about entomology, what do people expect you to tell them about insects? How to kill them. That's what everybody else wants to do, is just kill them all. And they're being really good at it because now I may be showing my age a bit, but we used to take drives out to the country to my grandparents' house. And when you came back, you could barely see through the windshield because of all the bugs on it. You've heard, you know, bugs on a bumper, you know, and country songs. You can drive as far as you want with the lights, with your headlights on in the dark and not have a bug on your windshield. And that is a warning. That is tragic because so many of our insects are dying. And it reminds me of the poem that was in the Phaeton, Wordsworth. What is man made of man? What are we doing to our environment and ultimately to us? Because if we kill off all the insects, we're next in line. A friend of mine is a wildlife biologist and he deals with endangered species. And he likes to say, we're all on the endangered species list. Every time we lose one, we move up a notch. So this is not something we want to have happen. And especially not with the honeybees because they are responsible for a third of our food. Every third bite of food you take came from the work of a honeybee pollinating flowers somewhere.
It's right here. You was using it to do your.
Okay, somebody needs to mute their microphone, please.
Okay, well, I'll start sharing my screen then and click on my talk and we'll get right into my pictures and stuff. So let's see how this works. Share. Can everybody see that? Picture,
Yes.
save the bees. Okay. So for one thing, we're talking about honeybees. And most people, when they think about bees, they think about when they were stung by a yellow jacket when they were a kid. And yellow jackets are not bees, as you know. They are wasps, and they eat bees. And that's a point I try to get across to people who are non-beekeepers and certainly non-entomologists, that we're dealing with gentle vegetarian honeybees, not bright yellow and black yellow jackets and other kinds of wasps. Honeybees are very furry, as you can see in this picture, and that's because they collect so much pollen and it sticks to the fur on their bodies. And then they comb it off and put it in pollen baskets on their hind legs, carry it back to the hive, and that's what the nurse bees eat to make the brood food that they use to feed the queen and the babies. So pollen is very important nutritionally, and this fur on their body is also a terrific insulator. And if you look really closely, you'll see that even their eyes are furry. And that is very unusual among insects. In fact, of course, I don't know about all insects, but honeybees are the only ones that I know of that have furry eyes. Even if you look at bumblebees and all the other bees that are around, we have like 400 species of native bees here in Maryland. None of them have furry eyes. People also question whether honeybees are native or not. And I contend that they are native, but they died out long ago. There were fossils found in, I believe it was Nevada, 2014. And they were from shale, and they could find impressions that where a bee had been flattened in the mud and left an impression there that they could see. And it was not Apis mellifera per se, but a related Apis insect, and it had furry eyes, hairy eyes. So I think we can say that they were here 14 million years ago. Like horses, they evolved in North America and then died out, and the Spaniards brought the horses back, and the Virginia colonists brought the bees back. But they're not an invasive alien species. They are actually old natives. So, but they're not the only pollinators at risk. Bumblebees are also really good pollinators. Look at the fur on this one. I don't know which bumblebee this is. Probably one of the entomologists here can cite the scientific name. I think it's called the golden bumblebee for some odd reason. And it's collecting pollen from and nectar from a coneflower. It's very fine yellow pollen like dust. So you can tell that that is the pollen that came from this flower. And why should we care about pollinators? Food, all kinds of food. This is just a tray at the table at the state fair with some of the prize winners. Peaches don't usually require pollination, but it benefits them. Peppers, they benefit from it. Pears, they aren't the main crops. Hay takes quite a bit of pollination. But I don't know about you, but I don't eat much hay. I tried it as cereal, and even if you put milk on it, it's still pretty tough to chew. But hay, what eats hay? What animals eat hay? Cattle and horses. We don't eat horses, but we do eat cattle. We eat their milk, drink their milk, all the dairy products that are made from it, cheese, butter, ice cream, all those good things, yogurt, all come from cattle. And then, of course, the beef and the leather. And about a third of the value of all of the beef and dairy products in this country are attributable to honeybee pollination of alfalfa hay. And they don't actually pollinate the flowers from the alfalfa as it's being grown for hay, because the farmer cuts it just as it starts to bloom. That's when the protein content is highest, and it makes the best feed for the cattle. But that farmer had to have a seed to plant. And another farmer raised alfalfa and brought in bees to pollinate it so that it would produce lots of seeds. And without that, you wouldn't have the hay and you wouldn't have the beef and the milk. So sometimes it's a couple of steps further back than the obvious, well, yeah, the bee pollinates an apple blossom and you get an apple. But it's still essential that we have those services. Over 100 farm crops are pollinated by honeybees. You can have a small orchard like this one, where Beekeeper brings in a couple of hives on the back of his pickup truck, and that'll pollinate about 2 acres of apples. Or you can have a larger scale. This is an orange grove in Florida. And when you look at these boxes, the bottom 2 are where the queen lays her eggs and the bees raise the brood, the baby bees that'll be the next generation. During the warm season, the worker bees only live about 6 weeks. So they have to constantly be replacing the bees that die of old age. So that's what the bottom part of the hive is for. These other boxes up above that are for honey. And in an orange grove, the bees collect a lot of nectar and make a lot of honey. So this is just a staging area. You wouldn't use an area like this for pollination, but they're getting ready to load these up and take them back and extract the honey and put it into jars. Other pollinators, hummingbirds. Our hummingbirds are so friendly. You can actually have a relationship with a hummingbird if you feed it, and they get to know you. They'll even come and hover near you when you're in the garden and say, "Hey, the feeder's empty," and they have their ways of communicating. Bumblebees, that's a golden bumblebee. Butterflies and moths, they are so-so as pollinators go, because their bodies are not terribly hairy and they have very long legs and long tongues, so they can collect nectar from the flower without actually wrestling with it and getting pollen all over their bodies. But they're pretty and they do some pollinating. Wasps, oddly enough, do some pollinating as well. This is a yellow jacket in a spotted touch-me-not, or also called spotted jewelweed. It's a wild impatiens. And the nectar is way back here in this little tail flower. So they have to crawl all the way in. And when they do, they cross the anthers, which have this very sticky white pollen. And I can tell when these flowers are blooming when I look into the beehive and I see a whole bunch of bees with this white stripe down their back. Well, this one crawled in on her side, so and I guess she's backing out at this point. But this is a yellow jacket, not a honeybee, but she does some pollinating. If she goes to another jewelweed flower, she goes to a different kind of flower, she's not. Little solitary bees, there are hundreds of species of solitary bees. Mason bees, well, you know all the different kinds. I think, what's this, an Algaclura? I'm not sure. But it's actually, this is one of my most published pictures, because you hardly ever find an insect actually pollinating a tomato blossom. So, but they do their share of the work too. Other native bees, this one's on a poke flower. Wildlife and all the various plants that are grown that aren't cultivated, all the wildflowers, also need pollination, and that's not measured or counted or put in the balance sheet of the value of honeybees and other pollinators, but there's an awful lot of pollination that goes on with other flowers and trees. This is a mason bee. It's another very hairy bee, and it collects a huge amount of pollen because it doesn't make honey. It just collects pollen and moistens it with a little nectar, makes a pellet, and goes back to its nest and lays a single egg on it. And that is the entire food supply for the larva that comes out of that egg. So then they usually wall it off with mud. That's why they call them mason bees, because it's like mortar in a brick wall. And then they'll collect a lot of pollen and make another big ball of pollen and lay a single egg on it. So they'll put 6 or 8 cells like that in a tube. If you put out cardboard, paper tubes like straws, pat straws, about 1/4 to 5/16 of an inch in diameter, put them out in March. And a lot of times these mason bees will fill them up. And they can fill up maybe 8 or 10 of those tubes before they die. They don't survive the season, but they leave cocoons in the tubes with the next season's insects. So it's a generation that the parents never see the children. So different kind of life cycle than we do. And of course, honeybees. If anybody ever asks you if a honeybee collects both pollen and nectar on the same trip to a flower, this is proof that does happen. She's got her pollen basket full of dandelion pollen, and her tongue is down in the flower collecting nectar. Dandelions are very important early nectar sources for honeybees and for a lot of other pollinators too. So if you see a lawn that's pristine green and not a single yellow button in it, that's a desert to pollinators. I already mentioned that it's not just bees that are dying off, but many, many other insects, including pollinators. They call it the insect apocalypse. I don't know if you've talked about that, but worldwide, they've done a census of flying insects and found that the populations are down approximately 70% in the last 30 years. And that is horrifying. Monarch, but now this talk is about a dozen years old. So I'll update some of the numbers. Monarch butterflies are disappearing, down 90% in 2012 alone. And they were down 90% again last year. So there are darn few of them left. So the area that they migrate to in Mexico has been shrinking. It was hundreds of acres, and now it's down to about an acre, I think, or a couple of acres. We saw migrating monarch butterflies in California years ago. And there were a couple of spots around Monterey. There, one place called itself Pacific Grove, the monarch capital of California. And there were some trees there that were just completely covered, festooning monarch butterflies, millions of them. And now you don't see a one. They're just gone. There is a state park there right on the ocean. I think it was Natural Bridge State Park. And we saw all kinds of monarch butterflies there. They'd land on your shoulder and you'd take a picture, a selfie with the monarch butterflies all over. And they don't come there anymore. So that's, again, a tragedy for the environment and for us. Many species of bumblebees are declining. And you'll notice this bumblebee is also working in echinacea with the fine dusting of yellow pollen. But look at the pollen on the bee. They look like ping pong balls in comparison to echinacea pollen. This pollen came from hibiscus, which was about 5 feet away. And that's one characteristic of bumblebees. They'll go from flower to flower to flower, and it doesn't matter what the species is, as long as it's got some food, they'll go to it. Honeybees and most mason bees too, there are some species that are flower constant foragers, and those are the really good pollinators. Because when they go from flower to flower to flower, it's dandelion to dandelion, dandelion, or apple to apple to apple, and not dandelion to apple. So they're carrying the pollen that the flower actually benefits from.
Cell phone.
Where's your cell phone?
Is it right there?
No.
Native bees, this is a beauty. She was, that's my arm. Just held it up and took a picture. I have no idea what species that is. If anybody does, let me know. but it's a fantastic looking creature. And she's actually, you can see her tongue there licking moisture off my arm. But nobody is really cataloging these. Sam Droege is doing it to some extent, but even he doesn't really study the life cycles that much. He looks for individual bees and tries to identify species of bees, and that's very admirable, but it's not enough. We need people to really do a serious study of the native bees that are out there and what their populations are and how their populations are changing. Because with all the insecticides used in the environment, I think they would have to be going down, just like the monarch butterflies and the honeybees. Honeybees started dying in the 1990s. Now, we had some invasive alien species, parasites of bees, that were brought in the late 80s. Accidentally, I hope they were brought in. But one was the honeybee tracheal mite, and the other was the varroa mite. And they had different ways of killing the bees, but in the late 80s and early 90s, it was pretty hard to keep bees alive. They were dying right and left from these mites. And then after a few years, they stopped dying from the mites and they became less of a concern. And by the year 2000, I mean, we had been putting chemicals in the hives to kill the mites and not the bees. And that's a pretty tricky balancing act, killing a bug on a bug, basically. But there were different chemicals that would affect the mites differently than honeybees. So it was fairly effective until the mites developed resistance to those chemicals. And then they were useless. But by about 1990, I found I didn't need to treat for mites anymore. They had co-evolved with the bees so that the ones that really were seriously deadly to the bees would kill off the bees, and that killed them. They killed the mites too. Any parasite that kills its host is not a very successful parasite because it's going to die in the process. And that's what happened to the honeybee tracheal mites. Within about 10 years, they had co-evolved with the bees so that they were not really causing any problems anymore. They're still there. If you look hard enough, you can find them, but you have to dissect the bee and look in the trachea with a microscope. So not too many people are spending a lot of time doing that since they're not causing any great damage anymore. I found the same thing happened with varroa mites that everybody's blaming now for the loss of the bees. And between about 2000 and 2011, the bees were thriving with no treatment of any kind for any mites. Just they had co-evolved so that the most virulent varroa mites had died, and the less virulent varroa mites managed to survive and reproduce. So if they didn't kill off the host, they didn't kill themselves. And that's pretty much the way parasitic relationships work. The parasite needs to take just enough so that it doesn't drain the host too much. Then there was colony collapse disorder. By the way, 1990 also is when the insecticides, the systemic neonicotinoid insecticides, first came on the market, 1994. The first one was imidacloprid, which to this day is the most used insecticide in the world. Imidacloprid. And they name these things so that they're very hard to pronounce unless you call them by the trade name, which is merit. Anybody can say that. You don't have to be a chemist to say merit. And my neighbor who treats their lawn very proudly tells people that their lawn is treated with merit to kill grubs that aren't there, just in case. And they're soaking their lawn multiple times a year with this systemic insecticide that kills everything, not just grubs. So, what has man done to man? So in 2006, this colony collapse disorder happened. Beekeeper I know took some colonies to Florida, which is traditional. It's warmer down there. You can do all sorts of things with them in the winter. they survive just fine up here in the winter, but you can't manipulate them or split the colonies or raise queens or anything like that. You need warm weather for that. So a lot of beekeepers will take their bees to Florida, let them eat nectar from the orange blossoms, and then they don't have to feed them, and they can raise queens and make new colonies and so on. So this one beekeeper that I know, David Hackenberg in central Pennsylvania, um, he set up a bunch of these new colonies in Florida that he was making. Came back a couple weeks later to see how they were doing, and they were gone. The boxes were there, but the bees were gone. And there would be a queen and a little nest of bees, little clot of bees, maybe that big, instead of like 30, 40,000 bees. And you've got maybe 100 left. And they put honey in the hive. The honey is still there. There's a little bit of brood. Most of the brood has died because they didn't have enough bees to cover it, keep it warm. It has to be incubated. The baby bees have to be incubated to 93 degrees in order to for the brood to develop and survive. And he was the first to raise the alarm that a lot of this a lot of colonies are just disappearing, and they for no apparent reason. And to tell you the truth, they still haven't figured it out. Even this almost 20 years later, they still don't know exactly what caused colony collapse disorder. But since then, we've had these massive losses, 30, 40%. Last year, the National Survey, which is a little bit sugar-coated, I'm afraid, said 48% lost during the course of the year. And that's pretty hard to deal with. You can imagine if all the cattle farmers lost half of their cattle every year where they just dropped dead in the field, there would be a big stink about it. And somebody would be trying very, very hard, spending a lot of money trying to figure out what was going on so they could stop it. Back in 2006, a bee researcher that I know from Penn State was trying to work with the Secretary of Agriculture. And, they were trying to get money to find out what was going on with the colony collapse disorder. Congress had actually appropriated money to the Department of Agriculture, but the secretary wouldn't spend it, wouldn't distribute it to the researchers. And after months of trying to get him on the phone and emails and intermediaries to try to contact this man and get a response from him, turned out they were both on a panel at a conference. And she buttonholed him and said, "What in the world is going on here? Why won't you let that money?" He says, "It's only bees." Only bees. He didn't care. And that is unfortunately a common problem. People just not caring. So even in 30%, that's 600,000 colonies per year. Now it's more like 1 million. And in Maryland in 2012, the statewide loss was 70%. And it's still in that range. Now, last year I had 20 colonies in the summer. By the end of February, I had one colony left out of 20, 95% loss. And I still have that one colony. It's still doing okay. I don't know why that one survived when the other 19 didn't. But I'm glad I had one anyway. But that's still, of course, as a bee lover, it's heartbreaking to see this kind of problem. This was a colony in 2012 in downtown Baltimore. I had had bees down there for some 30 years. They were always my most trouble-free, most productive colonies. There were lots of trees planted along the street, basswoods, locust trees, all sorts of nectar-producing plants. Patterson Park wasn't too far away. The bees would get nectar over there. And in downtown Baltimore, when the trees are not blooming anymore, they still manage to find this unique honey. And it's a little darker than the basswood, which is a light yellow honey that tastes like lemon. but this would be a little on the brown side. And if you tasted it, it was remarkably similar to brown sugar. And if you watch the bees, you can see them flying across the harbor to Domino and picking up spillage over there. So we call that Baltimore wildflower. But I haven't been able to get that for years because 2012, I had 4 colonies there. They all died. Unprecedented. Nothing like that had ever happened before. And this is the bottom board of a beehive just covered with dead bees. This is typical of a pesticide kill. So I brought 4 more colonies down there the next year. Same thing happened. They all died. Now, I am a very stubborn person. This went on 4 years in a row. And I kept hoping it would get better, and it didn't. So after 4 years of losing all the colonies every year, I finally gave up. There are no farms in downtown Baltimore. The pesticides have to be used on backyards or street plants, or this median plantings, median strip in the highways and the corner. And somebody started using these insecticides that are billed as plant protection products. They don't even tell you that they kill basically everything. They're just well, I'll show you a bottle of this stuff in a few minutes here. So what's causing this kill? CCD, bees just disappear, leaving a few bees in the hive. And nobody will touch that hive for a month. Other bees don't come in and steal the honey. Wax moths that normally destroy honeycomb and eat the honey and the pollen and the cocoons from old larvae that have spun their cocoons in there, the pupae, and they're very rich in protein. They'll eat that too. No wax moths. Pesticide kill, you get piles of dead bees in front of and inside the hive. And sometimes you'll find them twitching if they're still barely alive. A lot of them you'll find with their tongues sticking out. And that too is characteristic of a pesticide kill. Now, if they do starve, which would be the beekeeper's fault, because you have to monitor your hive and make sure that they have food all the time. If you harvest some honey, especially, you have to make sure that there's plenty of honey left for the bees. So you're not risking the survival of the bees by harvesting some of the surplus. By the way, they'll make 2 or 3 times as much honey as they could possibly eat. So it doesn't hurt them to harvest the surplus and eat it or sell it. But you do have to make sure that you leave plenty for the bees. Typically 60 pounds per hive for the winter. But with starvation, you'll pull out a honeycomb and you'll find many dead bees with their heads down in the cell, just trying to get their bodies as close together as possible to conserve what little heat they have left. And it's ultimately futile, but if they're still alive when you find them like that, you can spray them with sugar syrup and give them a little bit of food and bring them back. But usually they're past that. So what is causing this die-off overall? Starvation sometimes, parasites sometimes, viruses, and pesticides. As I mentioned, we didn't have a problem. The pesticides have been here for over 30 years. But we didn't have a problem with them to any great extent in the early 2000s. And then all of a sudden, it seemed like they became more of a problem. Well, there was a research study done at the University of Maryland. Scientist I know did the study. I helped him get the grant to fund it because I was president of the State Beekeepers Association a couple of years. And so he sent me a pre-publication copy of his research, the report that he was going to publish. And it said that he was studying imidacloprid as far as its toxicity to bees. He would add it to pollen patties, put it in the hive, measure how much they ate, how much consumed by the hive. He could figure dosage and everything. And he was very careful. It was a 3-year study. Each year he started with brand new equipment so that it couldn't possibly be contaminated from the previous year. And 3 years in a row, he got the same results. The low dosage imidacloprid didn't cause much of a problem. Very low dose. So we're talking like 1 part per billion. A little higher dosage, you would have higher mortality. You'd also have more varroa mites. And the highest dosage killed off like 42% of the bees, and they were loaded with varroa mites. So he said there was a dose-dependent relationship between mortality and between the number of varroa mites in the hive. So you can look in a dead hive and find all kinds of varroa mites, and you can see evidence of the viruses that they transmit to the bees. But are they the cause or are they a symptom? They may have just been a harbinger of what the pesticides were actually doing to the bees. They weaken the central nervous system, the immune system, and generally poison the poor insects. Now, there used to be lots of wildflowers in the spring. This is another problem, starvation. This is actually now the Baltimore County Agriculture Center. And they had a big field of sunflowers here. I took pictures of it last fall. But this field of just mustard was loaded with insects. This is another field about a mile from my house. Asters and goldenrod, this is mostly goldenrod, are important fall food sources for honeybees and for other pollinators. Some of that 60 pounds of honey that we have to leave in the hive for overwintering, a lot of that comes from goldenrod and asters. And if you don't have that, you have to feed them sugar syrup to make sure that they do have that 60 pounds. Now, well, this was a few years ago. They built houses along here. And look, you've got pristine green lawns. That's a desert as far as insects are concerned, as far as pollinators are concerned. And now they've planted something else over here. I forget whether it's corn or soybeans, but they use herbicides, and you just don't see these fields of food sources for pollinators anymore. Wildflowers are gone in this spot, and a lot of other spots around my area in Carroll County. That's what a varroa mite looks like. Rides on the back of the bee or gets in between the segments of the abdomen to hide, usually on the underside, the ventral side. We used to say they suck the blood of the bee. Actually, what they're sucking is the liver, the food sources, they call them fat bodies inside the bee that actually contain a lot more nutrition than the hemolymph. So we mentioned those, didn't mention small hive beetles. That's another newer parasite that causes a lot of damage. Varroa mites do transmit viruses. They're not so much sucking the blood as sucking the fat bodies out of the inside of the pupa. They go into the cell just before it is capped, where the larva turns into a pupa. And it's like that in case of a worker honeybee for about 9 days. In the case of a drone or male honeybee, it's capped for 12 days. So a foundress mite like this varroa mite can probably only reproduce one living mated female mite. Her offspring, male and female, mate inside the cell. Why the inbreeding hasn't destroyed them, I don't know, but they've managed to find ways to circumvent the problems of inbreeding. But she actually raises a male first, and then she'll lay eggs that turn into a female, and they mate, brother and sister, inside the cell. But she can only lay like 1 egg a day, and by the time the honeybee emerges, if it's a worker, only one of those females has managed to mate and be ready to lay eggs in another cell. The others just die from exposure when they are when the cell is opened and the honeybee comes out. But in a drone, they can make 3, and that will allow a logarithmic increase in population. So if they can find enough drones, they would much prefer to lay their eggs on the drones. If you open a beehive and find a lot of varroa mites on the worker cells, that means they've parasitized all of the drones and they're getting pretty desperate. But that colony is probably doomed because there won't be very many undamaged worker bees left to do the work. So the pesticides are the main problem, in my opinion. Poison the nectar and the pollen. This is what is my main gripe. And in fact, we got a law passed in the Maryland legislature to ban this stuff in 2016. You can't see it in this picture, but the main ingredient is imidacloprid. I'll show you some labels of a couple of products that Bayer puts out. This is for retail sale, and the Pollinator Protection Act of 2016 bans the retail sale of any product that contains systemic neonicotinoid insecticides. And there's a half a dozen of them. I could name them, but you wouldn't remember them anyway, unless you already know about them. So just consider them neonics. That's what most people call them. And they were in all these products. So now they can't sell these products with those chemicals in them. So they use other chemicals. They use pyrethroids or acephate or various other compounds. But they're not quite as bad, but they're close. Systemic means it gets inside. It's not a surface treatment. This stuff isn't even designed to be sprayed. It's granules you sprinkle on the ground. Rainwater carries it into the soil. The roots absorb some of it. They estimate about 20% of it is actually absorbed by the plant. The other 80% runs off eventually. It binds to the soil pretty well, so it'll stay there for quite a few years, but eventually it's going to run off and be in the streams and rivers and lakes and the bay, and then eventually the ocean. This stuff is also super deadly to crab larvae at levels in parts per trillion. And just as a benchmark, an idea of how much a part per trillion is, if I had $1 million and gave you 1/1,000,000th of it, you would get 1/10,000th of 1 cent. So don't spend it all in one place. Talking chemically, 1 part per trillion is 1 drop in not an Olympic-sized swimming pool, but 20 Olympic-sized swimming pools. 1 drop. It's very difficult to measure 1 part per trillion with most chemical apparatus. You've got to have a super sensitive mass spec, gas chromatograph, and everything has to be extremely clean. So you're not likely to find a lab down the street that can measure 1 part per trillion of anything. But that's enough to cause damage to crab larvae. And to bees, it may take 50 parts per trillion, but that's enough to sterilize a queen. She's already mated, has eggs. She makes eggs, but she has collects sperm from drones, maybe 20 drones when she goes on her initial mating flight when she's about a week old. She'll mate with a whole bunch of different drones and store that sperm in her body for her entire lifetime. But if she gets exposed to some of these neonics or other insecticides like chlorpyrifos, just on the outside, she doesn't even have to eat it. 50 parts per trillion will kill the sperm in her spermatheca, and then she's laying blanks. She can't produce worker bees anymore. So that'll kill a colony too. So these things are very, very toxic in very low concentrations. But look at this one, 3 systemic products in one: fertilizer, insect control, and disease control. This disease control is a fungicide called chlorothalonil, and that has been shown to make bees more likely to die from other causes rather than just direct poisoning. And they put in a little fertilizer, so it makes your plants green up, and then it looks really good. And after about 8 weeks, the plant doesn't look so good, so you have to reapply it. The systemic insecticides will last for years. So every time you apply it, you're increasing the level in the soil. So here they've got everything covered, the trees and shrubs and the roses and flowers, all the nectar sources, dual action formula, concentrate, deadly. There you can see, this was a cell phone picture because I didn't want to carry my real camera around the store. They're used to seeing people with cell phones, and it wouldn't do a really good job, but 0.22%, very dilute, wouldn't you think? Well, that amount and the 2 ounces of this product they tell the homeowner to spread on their roses puts about 150 milligrams on a plant. That's one dose, 2 ounces of the granules. That is 100 times what a farmer would use for a plant of a similar size, 100 times more concentrated. So these things seem like they are designed to kill pollinators. They're poisoning their nectar sources. Look at this, 3 different neonics in one product. Protects for 6 weeks, a lot longer than that. The clothianidin is for powdery mildew. That's another fungicide. Toxic pollen, of course, is going to kill the native bees that collect pollen to feed to their babies. So what can we do to help pollinators? We can plant flowers, such as mints. Most of the mints are good. Nectar sources. In your garden, autumn joy sedum. It's another good nectar producer in late summer when there aren't that many other flowers blooming. Trees, holly. You can actually, if there are enough holly trees, you can get a nice honey from them that has a distinctive flavor. Some friends of mine that have bees in the south, like Georgia and North Florida, will actually get some holly honey from down there. It's really delicious. Around here, the main nectar source is the black locust tree, and it blooms usually in May, anytime between April 21st and May 21st when it blooms. And the trees are just festooned with these white blossoms. They smell so delicious. You can smell them driving down the road. And they are actually legumes. They put nitrogen into the soil. And the flower looks just like a bean or a pea flower. And the stamens and the pistils are inside the flower until the bee lands on this, it's called the keel. And the weight of the bee pushes it down, and the stamens and pistils pop up. It's like a pop-up book. And then they can get to them, but they're very well protected from aerial pollution, rain, contaminated rainfall or anything like that. So it's a very clean way to provide food to the bees. Tulip poplar is another excellent nectar source. It's not so contained. It's the nectar comes from inside petals, and then it runs out into these bracts. And a lot of times the bees don't even get in here to pollinate them. But apparently it doesn't take much, because the tulip poplars I know are loaded with seeds, and they are fertile seeds. So they do get enough pollination. But they can collect 2 teaspoons of nectar every day in these little bracts that extend from the blossom. I wonder why they call this a tulip poplar. I don't know, I haven't figured that out yet. The bee will get inside there and sip up the nectar. Another excellent tree, basswoods or lindens. These are European lindens. It's a smaller variety than the American basswood, which grows to be a 100-foot tree, and massive shade trees. They used to be very popular in colonial times because that was their air conditioning plant. You plant them on the west side of the house, and they would shield the house from afternoon sun. And they were very popular. But nowadays, people don't want trees that big. But look at these. These are covered with blossoms. You can hear them buzzing a block away when the bees are working on them because they'll just be covered with bees going after them. This is in downtown Baltimore. This street is Falls Way on the right, and this Jersey wall over here, the concrete barrier. The other side of that is the Jones Falls Expressway. And I tried to keep my bees about 50 yards from there, so they were very close in a locked, gated churchyard. And they did great for many years until they just all died 4 years in a row. And now I've been down there to see if the basswoods are going to be blooming again this year. This is a row of stumps because apparently this was an encampment for homeless people. They liked the shade of the trees. So the city just cut them down, cut them all down. But there are lots of other trees in the city. I just wish they weren't treated with pesticides. So don't kill all of the weeds or wildflowers. This one has a paper wasp on it. There are lots of other insects that go after these plants. Paper wasps are very beneficial insects if they're not nesting right over your door. So don't use systemic pesticides, please. You can put out nest tubes for mason bees, these little cardboard tubes. You can buy them off the internet. They're extraordinarily expensive for cardboard tubes, but they're worth it. If you want some mason bees, come to me and I'll give you some. I've got a whole bunch of them on my front porch. You can become a beekeeper or at least support your local beekeeper. You can see how these people are running in fear for their lives from the vicious stinging insects. These are all brand new beekeepers, and she's actually holding that frame upside down. The bees don't care. As long as you're not squishing the bees, they're not going to sting you. To cherish, protect, and nurture the bees. Don't be afraid of them. They're not going to sting you. They're gentle vegetarians. If they do sting, they die. So honeybees, at least, are not something to be feared. Plant flowers, and please don't poison. Thank you very much.
All right. Let's put
I'm done. I'll answer any questions you've got.
There. There are questions in the chat.
Okay.
And we also can ask the audience if we can go with that first. Let people ask questions, and I'll read some that were in the chat.
Okay.
So anybody in the audience can unmute and ask a question if they want to.
I will let you know that as a master beekeeper, I can answer any bee question, which means that if I don't know the answer, I know enough to make up something that sounds plausible. That's a joke. Mike was the only one that laughed here. Look at this.
No, I was laughing.
Oh, that was you, Fred. Okay.
Oh, we're all muted.
Oh, that's true. Oh, yeah. You got to unmute there.
I was
Shall I
laughing
read?
too, but you know, if you know enough, you can convince other people that you know all the answers.
Right, right.
Yeah, we have some politicians that are very good at that, right? Mike Terrell asked a question in the chat. It said, you mentioned that you do not believe that the mites are a problem and do not treat for them. Any idea as to what your mite levels have been? Have you had your dead bees tested for evidence of pesticides?
Yes, I have had them tested for pesticides in past years, not every year. 1 year they found chlorpyrifos in the pollen in one of the hives. And that is strictly an agricultural product, so it had to come from the farms across the road. But for the most part, you know, those toxins are so deadly that you can measure them, you can look for them, but you're not going to find them, even if they're there, because they're below the level of detectability. Now, the Department of Agriculture takes samples to the USDA lab in Gastonia, North Carolina. and their limit of detection is 1 part per billion, which, yeah, if they got a really big dose, you might find it, but we're talking levels of 1/20th of that being able to sterilize a queen. So, 50 parts per trillion is just going to go like, that's a negative, that's a negative result. And I can find mites in my bees. And in past years, I have diligently monitored frequently, at least every week, all summer, to see what the mite counts were. I have treated, and the bees still died. I can kill millions of mites, but the bees still die here. Now, that's not true everywhere. I do know some beekeepers who have much better survival rates in a specific area where they maybe have a park or something nearby that's not treated with pesticides, and there are other uncontaminated nectar sources and pollen sources. But most of the people I talk to, like I said, I sold 100 nukes, and most of those people were replacing dead owls. So, and most of them had treated for mites. So, I don't know. It gets very frustrating. You want to protect your bees, and they're just they roam for 2 miles, a 2-mile radius, and that's just a rough approximation. It's often much more than that. But at 2 miles, you've got 80,000 acres, and I don't control 80,000 acres. So, what can I do? I just try to move my bees to another place if I can, but I want them where I live. And of course, I'm probably subjected to some of this pesticide contamination too. Look at me, I'm 23 years old.
It shows. Hey, we have a question from a student. Let's see. Ayo, are you listening? Did you have a question?
Yes, I have a question.
Okay, go ahead. Please ask. Go
Okay.
ahead.
Okay, thank you. And also I also want to say thank you to, I don't know if you're a professor, but Mr. Steve McDaniels. I want to thank you for your presentation.
Thank you.
I learned a few things. And my question for you is, so I'm really terrified of bugs, right? I tell you,
And you're
I'm
taking an
really-
entomology course?
I'm really terrified of bugs, right? And I do everything. Well, me and my family are all afraid of bugs, by the way. So we do everything to drive bugs away from our, environment. So we have like a lot of like pest control sprays and all that like around the house. So my question is, what would you say we do? Like, do you recommend, less toxic sprays, or like what do you recommend? Because I don't know, I don't want to kill nature. Well, I don't have fun killing nature, but what would you recommend?
If they're
What would
biting you, though,
recommend?
you're get them. Well, first of all, you have to identify which bugs are the problem. If you just want to kill all the bugs, then these products that they're selling are perfect. Disastrous, but perfect for that purpose. But if you're familiar with integrated pest management, where you escalate, as the problem increases in seriousness, you start off with the simplest, least toxic approach first, preferably mechanical or cultural controls without any chemicals. And then if it gets worse, then you may have to resort to chemicals. But
Okay.
that's integrated pest management. The first step is to identify what the pest is. If it's a mosquito, it's going to be a very different control from a yellow jacket. You got to know what it is you're trying to control, not just kill everything. Now, if you're having, sitting outside at night and enjoying the outdoors and you're being bothered by mosquitoes, set up a fan, just like a pedestal fan, and they don't like moving air; they like still air. And maybe a couple of fans if you've got a big crowd, and they'll drive the mosquitoes away. You don't have to poison them.
Okay.
Again, with mosquitoes, get rid of any puddles of water that sit around after rainstorms. We've had a lot of rainstorms, and even like a tarp with a little dip in it, bottle caps, bucket lids, any of these things, bird bath,
Mm-hmm.
rain spouts that sag, these will breed mosquitoes. And mosquitoes are typically stay within about 50 feet of where they were born. So if you get rid of those things in your yard, you'll have very, very few mosquitoes.
Okay.
Other insects, just it depends on what it is. For wasp, you can set out traps, and now's a good time to do that because you'll get the queens that are starting colonies for this year, and they don't build up in population very much until about August. But if you get them now, you nip it in the bud, and you just don't have those big colonies of yellow jackets and bald-faced hornets and stuff in the fall. One simple wasp trap is a friend of mine who's a beekeeper tells me she does this. I haven't actually tried it yet myself, but I plan to. A dish of soapy water, a screen over top of it, a coarse screen like hardware cloth with big holes in it. Put the cat food or tuna, piece of meat or something on there, and then cover that so that they can't get to it from above. But yellow jackets and other wasps will be attracted to the meat. Pollinators, for the most part, are vegetarians, not interested. So you're not going to catch bees that way. But the yellow jackets will go underneath the screen, eat the meat, and before they fly, they usually drop down. And if it's close enough to the soapy water, they just get in the soapy water and drown. So soapy water is a very effective insecticide if you get it right on the insect. Brown marmorated stink bugs. I suck them up with a vacuum cleaner, a shop vac with a couple inches of soapy water in it. You can spray them with insecticides and it'll look like they're dead. They'll lie on the ground and the feet are up. And a day or two later, they'll shake it off and detoxify the poison and be back in business. They don't recover from being drowned.
Okay.
So use those simple mechanical things or cultural methods if you're gardening. And I'll just find out, like for squash, you have squash bugs. Plant your squashes later. Squash bugs are active in the early to mid season. If you don't plant the seeds until late June or July, the squash bugs have completed their life cycle and they leave your squashes alone. So that's the kind of thing. It takes a little more work to look around and find out how you can treat for specific insects. But don't just kill them all, please.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
I think that's an excellent question. Thank you.
All right, we have in the chat box the study you mentioned where they added the pesticide to the hives.
Mm-hmm.
Did they ever test untreated hives to see how much pesticide they were bringing in?
That I don't know. I mean, they were intentionally adding measured amounts, and they did have controls, and they did it in a place where I guess they felt that they didn't have much contamination from outside. But I think it was Greenbelt, the National Research Center down there. So I don't really know how much was coming into the controls. They had a few losses with the controls, but it wasn't much. It wasn't any 42%.
Okay.
Steve, one of the questions
And,
that go along with that is when they were adding the known amounts of pesticide to the hive, could they actually detect the pesticide in the hive when they put a lethal dose in?
I don't remember whether that was part of the study or not.
It seemed to me that if they were adding
The thing is that they were putting it in a pollen substitute.
Right.
So you wouldn't be likely to find it in the honey or the nectar or the pollen that was inside the hive because that wasn't where it came from. So I think measuring those things probably wouldn't have told them very much. If they measured it in the body of the insect, when you think about how dilute a dose it takes to kill the insect, and maybe it's taken in a microliter and then it's diluted through the body of the insect, it's so dilute that it's well below detectable levels.
That was my question. It's likely to be below detectable levels, but in the ones where they put in a lethal dose or ID 70, which it kills most of the bees, but not all the bees.
Right.
At that dose, could they detect the neonicotinoid in the colony or in the bees or in anything in that colony? I would think that
I don't remember that part of the study.
Okay.
Yeah. I don't remember them doing that, but they might have. Interesting thing was that the version that I read was the pre-publication version, and the official version left out those two little comments about dose-dependent relationship between imidacloprid and varroa mites, and dose-dependent relationship between imidacloprid and mortality. Wasn't in the final version.
why? I mean,
People make a lot of money off of peddling these things, and they give a lot of money to the universities, and most of the research at the universities has to deal with varroa mites, or it doesn't get funded.
But virtually everything I've heard has been it's varroa, varroa, varroa. But one of the things that you mentioned is that if the neonicotinoids increase the varroa mite in the colony, then it is the varroa that what you see is the varroa killing
exactly.
But what's causing the increase in varroa is the neonicotinoids, and it's the varroa that are transmitting the various viruses that are killing the bees.
Yeah. I mean, they conveniently forget that, like between 2000 and 2011, thereabouts, varroa were here, but they weren't causing any problem. And they'll say, "Oh, well, that's because the virus wasn't here then." Well, then they go back through frozen samples of bees in the freezers in the universities and the Department of Agriculture from 30 years ago. And if they know what to look for, they can find those viruses. They were there. They just weren't killing bees. I knew a Dr. Toshiro Shimanuki. He was head of the Beltsville Bee Lab back in the early 80s. And his big thing was viruses. And he said, I can find all kinds of viruses in the bees, very, very low concentrations, and they never seem to cause a problem. You can find them in the flowers. You can find them picking up virus from another bee in a flower, or a flower that a bee has been to, and you pick up a virus from that. And I can find them and measure them and identify them, but I've never seen a bee get sick from them. Now there are 27 known viruses, and I think 7 of them are almost invariably deadly to the bees. So, if you find bees with wings that don't expand the way they're supposed to, they're all curled up and deformed. It's called deformed wing virus. And that's evidence of a heavy varroa population, because that's how it's transmitted usually.
Steve, could you mention the connection between the neonics and the increased mites, just so the students can hear that again?
Okay. A researcher at the University of Maryland took measured amounts of neonicotinoids, especially imidacloprid, which is the most common one. I think that's the only one he studied. They try to keep it simple. And added that to pollen substitute. It's a protein patty that you can put in a hive that takes the place of the pollen in their nutrition. And they're designed so that they have pretty much the same amino acids that the pollen has that the bees need. Bees have certain essential amino acids that they can't produce the same as we do. They may be slightly different ones, but they also need to have particular amino acids in their diet. And these substitutes provide that. And they could add measured amounts of imidacloprid. I think the control was 0, and then I think it was 5 parts per billion, 20 parts per billion, and 100 parts per billion. And that's still pretty darn small. That's like the highest one is like that's 1/10 of a part per million. So it's very low amounts in these patties. And they would put that in the hive, and the bees would eat it, and they would weigh it, see how much they actually consumed, and calculate how much of the compound was spread throughout the hive, and then see how the hive did. And a lot of times they didn't survive.
Okay, so then the mite population increases when the bees die.
Yeah, they
and-
found the mites would increase with the higher doses of imidacloprid.
Gotcha. Okay, thank
Yeah.
you.
They just,
Well-
I had colonies, remember in 2012, I had a colony, it was very strong. It was a brand new colony. It had built up and it made 3 boxes of honey on top, which is like 100 pounds. That's phenomenal because the statewide average is about 25. And they were right in my front yard and they were doing great. And then all of a sudden, they started getting robbed out by other bees. And may have been some from my yard, but I saw some, track them in their flight, and some of them went back into the woods behind my house. They just stopped defending their hive. And there are certain tricks you can use to stop robbing bees. The only thing that worked was for me to block the entrance completely. I've tried water sprays and baffles and all sorts of different things. This hive just gave up. It just was walking dead. And within a month or so, it was dead. So there is no virus or mite that I know of that can cause that. That had to be a pesticide exposure. Even though that didn't kill them outright, it injured them so much that they couldn't survive. Sad.
Yep. So one last thing in the chat was about your neighbor. You mentioned the neighbor puts a lot of neonics on their lawn.
Yeah.
Do your bees feed on that lawn?
No, but he has maple trees. And maples have shallow roots. And they have flowers in the spring that produce wonderful nectar, and that's an important early nectar source for the bees. So they will go to a maple tree, and if it's surrounded by neonicotinoid treated lawn, its roots are going to absorb it. And that could be the source of much of my problem right now, because he's cut down some of the maple trees, but he still has several over there. And you can see the bees going back and forth to him. So I can't keep the bees away from him. I'm kind of glad when he cuts one down. Normally,
Yeah, I guess.
Normally I'd love to see him plant trees because I'm on the Carroll County Forestry Board and I'm into trees too. But in that case, especially maples that have surface roots. And there was another scientist at the University of Maryland that did this study, and they found that one application of imidacloprid around a maple tree, just one application, they could find it in the wood of the tree 7 years later.
Wow. Wow, man.
And that's not
That's
4
amazing.
applications a year. That's one.
Wow.
But in woody
So-
plants, it's very durable.
You haven't been able to convince your neighbor to cut down on the chemicals, I guess, for his, he must really love to
No.
have
We
obsessed with
get along personally, but our our world views are polar opposites. I put solar panels on my roof and he faulted me for that. I bought a Prius and he faults me for not paying enough road tax. It's a no-win situation there.
No, I guess not.
He actually puts out poison bait for the bees. He told me that sugar syrup laced with poison.
Why? He must
He hates the
like you or
bees.
something.
He hates the bees. And his wife is even worse. She gets a spot on her picture window in the front. And she says, I can't see through my window. Spots from the bees. And the bees
Oh my God.
they do go out and eliminate, especially in the springtime, especially when I get 100 new ones in the yard. and there are the yellow spots all over the place. They wash off, but it's irritating for a couple of days. Well, he's got a Corvette, and if he takes it out back and washes it, the bees will go over there to collect water, and then to lighten their load, they poop, and he'll get spots on his car.
On
So,
this
of
car.
course, there are also wild bees that do that, but they're very diligently trying to kill them all off. It's sad. It's like that Department of Agriculture secretary who said, "Yeah, they're just bees. Why should I care?"
Well, I'm glad that you've pointed out all these things and the importance of reducing chemicals here, especially for the students here this tonight. Are there more questions from the audience before we decide to adjourn here? Anybody else want to ask anything or type something in the chat? Please do so. And
There was one thing I should address. I mean, they asked if I was a professor, and no, maybe from my own university. They did name a university after me, McDaniel. McDaniel.
Haha, there you go.
Yeah, but my background is, I have a degree in chemistry from Harvard, and the year I got out of Harvard, I planned to go to graduate school, but for some reason, the government wanted me to go to the other side of the world and shoot at people that I didn't know. So I decided to teach high school science for 3 years until the Vietnam War was over. And then I started taking pictures and getting paid for that. And I found that I really enjoyed the photography. And then I did nature photography. And then I got into beekeeping. And the rest, as they say, is ancient history.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for
You're
speaking
welcome.
for
Thank you
us
for
tonight.
inviting me.
Absolutely. Thank you for all your information. And so anybody else have something or not? We don't need to
Fred, before you came
yeah.
here, you were a little late coming in. I did mention